So this is how we make a cultured vegetable with very little or no salt, using cabbage, chopped kale, collard leaves, some leek, 3 carrots, cabbage is over here, and cauliflower. The first thing you do is to take half a cup of warm water and dissolve the starter culture, which is this one here, into the water. You can open up the package and make sure everything's out. There's quite a bit hiding in the corners, so I scrape it in. And I add half a teaspoon of good sugar, like preferably something that isn't real sugar. This one is monk fruit, to feed it. Stir it around and let it sit. Ideally it sits for 20 minutes. And I set it aside. Now I start processing. There's also one more thing I add for minerals, which is really good for feeding the good bacteria that are in the starter and developing them so they can multiply once they start eating processing the cabbage. So here it's called shallot. It's some kind of very deep earth mineral. It's called fulvic acid, or 70% fulvic acid. Shallot. I get it from this vitamin company, Swanson's. I'll keep it just for that purpose. So I put about 4 of them in, and they just get everything moving, because the good bacteria you want to promote, and because you're not using salt, you have to really give them an advantage over the natural bacteria that would form in the veggies. Alright, so that's that mix. I've already washed and chopped much of the vegetables, but I'm still going to finely slice the collard. The way I did the kale, I will also do with the collard, because I've got it on the fine blade on this, so I'm just going to make a bit of noise and let it finely slice the collard. Here we go. It's like shredding it. And I've got this on the number 1 setting, number 2 setting for the bronze slicer. It's not very sharp, so it gets very noisy and it starts building up stuff. So I've got a leek here because I thought it'd be nice to add a little leek to the mix. So I'll put that one in. There's a few pieces on the top. Like I said, it's not a very sharp thing, so. Oh yes, and I've poured hot water into all of the containers to kind of take away any edge that might be there. It didn't have to be sterilized, but at least a little hot water and rinsed. Okay. Also peeled the carrots. So now it's the cabbage turn. So I took off all the outside leaves that were thin and not full of juice. And then anything that had gray matter in it. So I'm going to cut that into pieces that can go in the food processor that will just fit. And here's the other cabbage. Cut it in half. You want to take the core out because the idea is to try and have everything about the same size so that it will all process at the same time. If you leave big chunks of anything, there's a risk that it won't get turn galactic fermentation process won't reach it in time with it, and the other stuff will be overly processed. So you want it to be even, all of the parts even. Right, so here's taking out the other core, slicing it into sizable chunks that will go in the food processor. Right, and here's some left over. So I've used about 2 cabbages. The recipe calls for 1, but I'm just adding extra because these, I've had these for quite a while and I don't want them to be wasted, so might just take a bit more flavoring to the mix to compensate. I'm just going to put these here for a minute before I take out the tough center core. Basically, and again, these will have to go in to be sliced as well. So I'm going to turn this off while I make. Alright, so I'm going to show you what happens when I it's not sharp, so I have to take it apart every 2 minutes. Anyway, that's what it was. At the end, I go through and take out, oh, that was obviously something, shouldn't have been in there, the core. Yeah, the core shouldn't have gone through. Alright, so I'm going to just keep on making this noise, process these. If you have a really good knife, you just finely chop and finely slice it. So maybe I'll get Cliff involved here. You want to try it, slicing it, Cliff? There's the core that I should have taken out. So the idea is to go like this and just finely slice it as thin as you can get. The whole trick is to try and be uniform. Okay, you can do it your way, that way, the right-handed way. So I go through this and I pick out all the things that are too big and put it back to, this is the bunch that I did earlier, with the machine. Alright, so here's some more flat pieces. Anything really big and chunky. If you flip it over and over, the stuff kind of appears and you see it's big flat slices rather than thin little slices. So anyway, I'll put them over in the corner. And as you go along, you dump it into. Alright, so we'll dump that in. These are some of the big pieces. Cauliflower, you want to do this one too, Cliff? And I'll work on the garlic. And for this recipe it calls for celery seeds, which I don't have, and 2 to 3 cloves of garlic, which I've got one giant one, so I'm going to work on peeling it. Cliff does that. And I think I'll just get him to slice it. So there we go. It's getting a wee bit thick here, Cliff. I'll go a little thinner, even if you have to go this way, as long as it's really finely chopped. So I have excuse me, basil and dill seed. It calls for oregano, celery, and basil. So I'm using dill seed and basil. So 1 tablespoon of basil. And I use the same as celery seed, 1 tablespoon of celery dill seed. Because I said I'm using more because it's a bigger recipe, I'll just finish off my basil. Yeah, there we go. So that's that. So the next step is, after we've chopped it all, gone through it, the big pieces, you can either take them out and chop them in, or you can just keep them in a pile for your compost. Alright, so I mix it all. You kind of squeeze it as you mix it. That helps break it down and get the juices flowing, which is what you want, because you want, when you put it in the jar, you want it to be covered with its own juice, so it will, no oxygen to get in there and start some weird bacteria growing. Alright, so that's one thing we do with the first feed jar, is we have to go get the jar down in the shelf there where the big gallon jars are. Just get a nice one with, as long as it's got a wide opening, it's easier to get in there and squish things down. Yeah, the finer the better. Okay, so there's a bit more to go. You might use the processor for the carrots. So this needs to be, all of this needs to be chopped. And yeah, I forgot, when you're first taking it apart, some people keep the bigger pieces, a few bigger pieces to put on top to kind of keep everything down under the liquid. So I set aside some of those. And the rest can be chopped. Okay, Cliff, good. The flavor will seep through, so it's not so critical. Let it be finely chopped. Right, so let's get this in there. Gallon jars are downstairs in the cupboard downstairs. The big one. Alright, so we keep going with this slicing business. And there's the carrots. I think 2 is fine because they're huge. Alright, and the other thing that's left is the cauliflower. So I'm going to just throw the cauliflower in there. So we're almost through all the ingredients. That in there. Okay, the process for making this without adding salt means that you have to break it down manually, which involves hands and the actual blender. And to the blender we add the starter mix, which has all the good, what's it called? L-plantarum, which is a kind of probiotic that's like a really good one for setting up everything in your bowel. Can survive lots of insults, and it also is a keystone type bacteria. Anyway, so we're going to add this to, rather than the blender, I'm going to use the other blade on this, as I think it might work better. Anyway, I'll try both. So we're going to take approximately 1/2 of this mix. So I think I'll use this actually too. So you actually need 2 bowls. This will be the finished blended mix after I've added it to this. I'll get this out of the way. It's here, over there. Okay, so half would be, I think I'll take half and put it in there, that way we'll know exactly, guesstimate. I'll take half of it. Looks to be about half, yeah. Alright, so now I'm going to blend all of this with the starter. And we can add a little water if it's binding up. So I'm going to put it in there. And start it moving. Yeah, you have to be careful not to put in like a really strong herb that breaks down and it becomes very too strong in flavor. But this is breaking it down really good, just like a blender. So it's not sinking down and adding itself to the bottom layer, so that's why I have to keep on pushing it down. The next batch I will put half as much in, and it will save a lot of time. So keep going. Starting to collect. Almost there. You don't want to add too much of water because then you're just diluting the natural juices. There we go. Okay, I'm just about done there. Great. Will be added to the original mix, the half that didn't get blended. And we're doing all this without salt because many people have trouble with fermented foods because of the high salt content. So this is one way to, plus salt inhibits the processing of the vegetables with the bacteria. It inhibits some of the good bacteria, so this will speed things up. So you just want it to break it down into pea size. You don't want it to, not pea size, but finely chopped, like chopped nuts. And then, once that's all done, I wouldn't put the onions in, for example, like whole onions. Luckily it was just like, and process it like this, because onions will become very strong flavor. I would wait, if I had onion in the recipe, I would wait till the end and just add it at the very end for flavor. Finely sliced, but not blended. Alright, so one thing I didn't get was bay leaf. I love putting bay leaf in things. So here we are, we have all the mix together. Your kitchen will be a disaster area, but just think it's only vegetables. You can easily clean it. So now's the time to squeeze. To just squeeze to get the juices flowing. You mix it all together and you just squeeze. It's a really good hand exercise. We look for any really big pieces and pull them out too. So once you got all the liquids sort of really juicing flowing, then you take the jar and bit by bit, layer by layer, you put it in, squeeze it down until the layer of juice covers the layer. Okay, so we pretty well got it all very mushy. I've taken out any big chunks and just set them aside for the compost, something like that. So now I use the extra bowl to put the jar in, because the jar will get mess around it. So I take a handful at a time, maybe 2 handfuls. Then I use my knuckle to layer it down, press with the hand, the fist, top of the fist. And keep pushing it down until you see the juices coming out. You won't see juices on top at this point, but you will feel that it's getting quite wet. And what you're trying to do is push out all the air above air, so that liquid will be what's in between all the spaces. So when you look at the side as you're pushing it, you see the liquid rise right up to the side. That's filling the air space. So that's basically it. You're just driving out all the air. And when you do it without salt, and you use we always use a starter, a vegetable starter, it will only take around 5 days to process, rather than however long, the usual sauerkraut process is. It's speeded up because of the starter. The extra starter is also the lack of salt. So it's coming, all the liquids are rising, and you'll find that a big air jar will probably just be plenty, even though it was a giant container of vegetable matter, because squeezing it really compresses the material. I'm not sure what the change in volume is, but it's much smaller than when you would expect from the area of veggie that you put in. So here I go. It may not even fill this container. It may actually be only half full at the end. So there, I go round and round. You want a jar that you can at least fit your fist into when you're making sauerkraut. You don't need to have a lid for it, so it doesn't matter if there's no lid for the jar. I mean, it will be nice to have a lid at the end when you want to keep it in the fridge and whatever, but you don't need it for the processing. You could transfer it to another container after if necessary with a lid. Alright, so that's good. It's all coming up. The liquid's pouring out the sides. And using kind of basically 2 handfuls at a time. Alright, so when we get near the top, this might actually be too big a jar, because ideally you don't want any air to touch the vegetable matter at the top. And my method to keep it weighted down is to take a plastic bag that's sterile and fill it with water inside on top. And that kind of, the weight of the water keeps everything under, all the vegetable matter under the liquid that it's formed. You make sure you don't get a bag that has been used before. You want to have a sterile bag. So in this case, because it's a big area, I'd have to use a gallon size bag. So that's what I do. I take a fresh bag that's never been used, and I put it inside this, and then I fill it up with water till I see the liquids all covered. So here's my bag. I take a bag, brand new bag, freezer bag. There we are. Open it up. Keep my hands inside, nothing outside. And push the bag around like that and pull it. Okay. Now I'm going to pour water in until I see the level of the juice rising up above the level of the bag. So here we go. Water. Doesn't matter what kind of water, because it's not going to go into the mix. And then once this is, I go in there with my hand and push it down to make sure that there's no air, and it's just the liquid from the veggies that's risen up. See, the weight of the water isn't quite sufficient yet, so I'll add more water. And I keep it in a room where, I keep it in a cupboard where it gets not get cold, but it's not hot either. Cold slows everything down. Heat speeds everything up. So I take this out, I wipe the bottom with a cloth and put it in some kind of flat bottom container to keep it from leaking. I use this one here because I can put several jars into it. It's just a baking container. So that's what I'll do now. I'll transfer this to that. I'll put that in the cupboard. I have a special cupboard just set aside for that. I'm just going to lift it because I have a sore. And I'm going to wipe it a bit. This is going to go in the cupboard. Usually I put this in the cupboard first and then bring the jar over. So just so you don't end up tipping it. And what you'll find, we'll go off to the cupboard. So here it is inside this, we have this regular cupboard, and it's sitting inside the tray. And the reason for the tray is that usually when it's fuller, the fermentation will cause this to sort of rise up and the juice will overflow and go into the container. And what you do after a day is you basically take the container out, rinse it, and put it back. And then it should stay stable. It shouldn't be bouncing up and down. And you just leave it, and you can test it in about a week just by taking a sterile fork or something and getting down behind the layer of the water on the outside and tasting it and seeing if it's got a nice pickle flavor, like tanginess. It should never taste like buzzing. It shouldn't buzz your tongue. It should just taste slightly acidic. And if there's any mold, you can read about that. There's different kinds of mold that just mean that it's been exposed to the air. You'll have to read up. Anyway, so that's it. You've got